Hey there. Tonight we're traveling through narrow alleyways and crowded marketplaces, not to the romanticized food tours of modern cities, but to the raw, desperate hunger of ancient streets where survival meant finding your next meal from a stranger's cart. You can smell the wood smoke mixing with rancid oil, hear the calls of vendors echoing off stone walls, feel the press of unwashed bodies, all searching for the same thing, something, anything, to fill the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. You'll witness the birth of commerce itself, born from hunger and necessity, where food wasn't art, but desperation made edible. If this kind of slow, grounded history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always comforting to know who else is out there listening to the same quiet stories of forgotten hunger. So, dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in something warm and settle in. We're going back to when the streets themselves were humanity's first restaurants, born not from choice, but from the simple, relentless need to survive another day. You don't choose to sell food on the streets of ancient Mesopotamia. You don't wake up one morning in 3000 BCE thinking you'll become an entrepreneur. You wake up hungry and you realize the barley you ground yesterday might be worth more cooked than raw. The sun hasn't fully risen over Babylon, but you're already there, squatting beside the city wall with your small clay pot balanced over 3 stones. The fire underneath crackles with dried dung and scraps of wood you gathered before dawn. Your hands are already stained black from the charcoal, your fingernails permanently embedded with ash and grain dust. You don't have a shop, you don't have a sign, you just have this pot, this fire, and the smell of cooking barley that makes people slow their steps as they pass. You watch them approach, laborers heading to the ziggurats, scribes carrying their reed styluses, mothers with children clinging to their robes. Their eyes find your pot first, then your face. You don't speak the same language as half of them. Trade has brought people from distant lands to this crossroads of civilization, and hunger speaks louder than words anyway. The transaction is simple. They point, you ladle. They drop small pieces of silver or copper into your palm, or sometimes they offer something else, a handful of dates, a piece of pottery, anything with value. You don't weigh portions precisely. You just fill their bowl until they nod, until that look of desperate calculation leaves their eyes. This is how it begins, not with business plans or market research, but with the fundamental recognition that cooking food takes time most people don't have, fuel most people can't gather, and skills not everyone possesses. You become valuable not because you're ambitious, but because you solve the most basic problem humans face every single day. The smell of your barley porridge mingles with the dust and donkey dung of the street. It's not pleasant by any measure you'd recognize today, but to the people walking past, it smells like survival. It smells like not having to gather fuel, not having to tend a fire, not having to clean a pot afterward. It smells like solutions. Sometimes a guard will hassle you about permits that don't exist yet, about taxes that haven't been invented. Sometimes other vendors will set up too close and you'll have to negotiate territories with gestures and broken phrases. But mostly you just squat by your pot and watch civilization grow hungry around you. The wealthy don't buy from you, they have servants who cook elaborate meals in private kitchens. But everyone else, the majority of humanity living in this first great experiment in urban living, they need what you're offering. They need food that's ready now, that doesn't require them to stop their daily struggle long enough to build a fire and tend it for hours. As the day progresses, your pot empties and refills with whatever grain you can afford. Sometimes it's barley, sometimes emmer wheat, sometimes a mix of whatever fell from traders' carts. You learn to season it with wild herbs, with the salt that caravan drivers prize so highly. Not because you're trying to create cuisine, but because slightly flavorful food costs more than bland food, and you need every copper piece you can earn. When the sun sets, you carry your pot home, if you have a home, or to whatever corner of the city you can claim for the night. Your back aches from squatting all day. Your eyes water from the smoke. Your hands are burned in a dozen places from tending the fire and handling hot clay. But tomorrow you'll be back, because this works, because hunger is reliable and cities are full of hungry people who have no time to cook. You've stumbled onto something that will outlast empires, that will spread to every corner of the world where humans gather in large numbers. You've invented street food, and with it, you've invented a way of living that millions will follow for the next 5,000 years. You don't live in Rome because you want to. You live in Rome because the empire has dragged you here, as a slave, as a freedman, as a citizen seeking work in the greatest city the world has ever seen. And now you're hungry, walking through streets that smell of fish sauce and burning olive oil, looking for something you can afford. The morning air carries the sound of vendors calling their wares before you can see them. Hot chickpeas, in Latin, then repeated in Greek, then in whatever barbaric tongue might attract the Germanic slaves working the construction sites. Fresh bread, still warm. The calls echo off the narrow walls of the insulae, the towering apartment buildings where most of Rome's 1 million inhabitants live, stacked atop each other like goods in a warehouse. You follow your nose down the Subura, the sprawling slum where the air is thick with smoke from 1,000 cooking fires. Here, in the shadows of 7-story buildings that lean so close together you can barely see sky, the real business of feeding Rome happens. Not in the grand triclinia of the wealthy, where slaves serve elaborate banquets, but in these narrow streets where survival is measured one meal at a time. A thermopolium catches your attention. Not much more than a counter with large clay jars embedded in it, but it smells like food and warmth. The proprietor, a weather-beaten freedman from Gaul, gestures toward his offerings. Hot chickpeas seasoned with cumin and coriander, lentil stew thick with vegetables, posca, the sour wine mixed with water that workers drink, because it's safer than the water alone. You don't eat sitting down. There are no chairs, no tables. You stand at the counter with a dozen other people, holding your clay bowl while the vendor ladles stew into it with a wooden spoon, stained dark from years of use. The bowl burns your palms. The steam rises into your face, carrying the scent of herbs you can't identify, but have learned to associate with food that will fill your belly. Around you, conversations flow in 6 languages. A Syrian merchant argues with an Egyptian scribe about grain prices. Germanic tribesmen brought here to build the emperor's new baths gesture wildly as they describe something in their harsh, unfamiliar tongue. A group of Jewish freedmen discuss theology while sharing a pot of chickpeas seasoned with garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans put on everything. The food is simple but substantial. Bread soaked in olive oil and vinegar. Sausages grilled over charcoal braziers that fill the narrow street with smoke. Mulsum. Honeyed wine that makes the day's labor seem more bearable. Nothing is elaborate. Everything is designed to be eaten quickly by people who have work to do and nowhere to sit. You finish your bowl and hand it back to the vendor, who rinses it quickly in a basin of murky water before filling it for the next customer. Your stomach is full for the first time in days. The warmth of the food spreads through your body, making you temporarily forget that you have no idea where you'll sleep tonight or how you'll eat tomorrow. This is how Rome feeds itself, not through grand state distributions of grain, though those exist for citizens, but through these countless small transactions between strangers. Street food isn't a luxury here, it's infrastructure. It's what keeps 1 million people from starving in a city that never stops growing, never stops demanding labor, never stops consuming everything the empire can provide. As afternoon turns to evening, the character of the street food changes. Vendors wheel out carts selling nuts roasted in honey, dried fruits from distant provinces, pastries sweetened with precious sugar from India. These are treats for people with a few extra coins, food that provides pleasure rather than just sustenance. But even as the wealthy emerge from their villas to sample exotic delicacies, the basic rhythm continues. Workers finishing their shifts at the amphitheater construction stop for bowls of barley porridge. Slaves sent out by their masters to buy dinner choose between a dozen different vendors, each offering variations on the same essential theme. Hot food, ready now, cheap enough for people who count every sestertius. The smoke from hundreds of cooking fires creates a permanent haze over the neighborhood. The cobblestones are slick with spilled oil and food scraps. Stray dogs weave between people's legs, hoping for dropped morsels. It's loud, dirty, chaotic, and absolutely essential to the functioning of the greatest empire the ancient world has ever seen. This is civilization built one meal at a time, one hungry person at a time, in the narrow spaces between grand buildings where ordinary people do the extraordinary work of keeping themselves alive in a city too large for any one person to comprehend. You wake in medieval London to the sound of bells, not church bells, though those ring constantly, but the smaller bells that vendors tie to their carts to announce their arrival in your neighborhood. It's barely dawn, but the city is already hungry, and hunger doesn't wait for convenience. The streets outside your tenement are narrow and dark, barely wide enough for two people to pass without pressing against the overhanging upper stories of the buildings that lean inward like conspirators sharing secrets. The air smells of wood smoke, human waste, and something indefinably organic. The smell of too many people living too close together with inadequate sanitation. But underneath it all, you catch the scent that draws you out. Hot pies. You follow the smell to Cheapside, where the vendors have already claimed their spots for the day. A pie man stands behind his wooden cart, calling out in the accent of Yorkshire, "Hot pies, meat and onions, still steaming." His voice carries over the general din of horses, carts, and early morning conversations conducted in the mixture of English, French, and Latin that makes up the linguistic stew of medieval London. The pies sit in a wooden tray lined with straw, their crusts golden brown and glistening with rendered fat. They're small, no larger than your fist, but dense with meat and gravy. The vendor wraps yours in a scrap of cloth that's been used for the same purpose dozens of times before. You don't question the cleanliness. Cleanliness is a luxury for people who have alternatives. You eat while walking,